What's up, guys? Today we're going to learn how to do basic mixing fundamentals inside Ableton Live using Ableton devices. And I'm going to walk you through step by step on how we would create a good signal chain to mix inside a track that you might be working on in the future. So let's go ahead and get started. I have a track here with a friend I produced with down in Denver, Colorado. Her name is Sky. And what I'm going to show you is just kind of a good workflow from start to finish for each instrument. Today we're just going to focus on the absolute basics, so this is for people who are just starting to wanting to learn how to mix. And let's get started. So Ableton recently released its tape emulation right here. If I drop it onto this track, I can see it's on the lead guitar, and automatically just having this tape on here, we're going to get some nice warm thick saturation. A lot of times you'll hear mixes, or if you're working on a song and you export it and you're like, man, it still doesn't sound really big and rich and thick. It's probably because you're not saturating your instruments. So tape is a really good way of doing it. There's a lot of other plugins out there that are made for saturation and distortion. Saturation is just a fancy word for distortion. So the new Ableton tape device is fantastic for doing this, and we're going to put that very first on the track on this lead guitar. I have the audio right here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to loop a part in the song where this lead guitar kind of stands out with like the main part of the mix where there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm going to drive the input a little bit, and that's going to give it a little bit of that tape warmth that we have, and then I'll drive it a little bit. And whenever we're mixing something, we want to totally overdo everything we're doing from a mixing standpoint and then back it off to taste, just so we can hear what we're really actually doing to the instrument. And we have some other things, other toys in this tape device that we can play with. I'm going to leave those alone for now. And then I'm going to pull back some of the output gain because I drove the input to give it some of that tape saturation emulation. And now it's a little louder than I want it to be, so I'll back it off a bit. Alright, so saturation, that's the first thing we're doing on this instrument. The next thing we typically would do is what I would call reductive EQ. So I'm going to drop an EQ8 on here, and then you can open this little window so you can see a little more as the frequencies are bouncing around of what you're doing. And what I'm going to do with reductive EQ is basically, it's just a fancy way of saying I'm going to cut frequencies that I don't want. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to boost a certain frequency, and I'm going to do what's called the sweeping technique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten up the Q here, and then I'm going to sweep back and forth and listen to anything that might be piercing that maybe I don't want. So I can see there's a piercing frequency. It doesn't really sound super great right there. So I'm going to tighten this up a little bit, and then I'm going to do some reductive EQ. So I'm going to cut some of that out of here just a little bit. And we don't want to do anything too extreme. Like I said, we want to be extreme at first and then back it off to taste. And another thing in a reductive EQ is we have to remember when you have a kick and a bass and a lot of other frequencies that build up in the low energy of a mix, what happens is a lot of sub energy will actually cause our mixes to sound really cluttered and gross in the mid and the high range. And it can just be something that's going on with your bass. Sometimes when people are mixing a bass guitar or like a sub bass or an 808 kick drum, when they're listening to their mix, like, man, it just doesn't have enough bass. And sometimes it's actually because you have too much bass with too many instruments with all this sub energy building up over time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut some of this out with a low shelf, or even maybe I'll use a high pass. And you're not really hearing much of stuff going on down there, but it makes a difference just cutting it out anyway over the course of every instrument when all that sub energy is building up over the song. Same thing with having too much high frequencies up here. So that's my reductive EQ. And I'm going to move on to compression. So I'll drop a compressor on here, and I'll set the ratio. The ratio is determining how hard this compressor is working. If I have a 1-to-1 ratio, that means the compressor's not working at all. 2-to-1 is pretty low. I'm going to set this around 6. So I'll have a 6-to-1 ratio. And And I'm going to set the attack so the initial punching of this guitar is coming in pretty quick. So I'm going to set the attack for this guitar somewhere maybe around, it's a plucky sound, so I'll keep it somewhere around like 20. And then we have an auto release, which is nice, so it does the work for us as far as letting go of that guitar. And a compressor essentially is reducing the dynamic range. People a lot of times think the compressor makes things louder because of this. And the reason it's getting louder is because the makeup gain is on. Actually, what a compressor does is it actually makes things quieter. It's squishing the frequencies of what's going on. But this can be really great for shaping sounds and for making drums punch really hard and for making a guitar not be super loud at one point and then super quiet at others, but kind of finding that happy balance of volume so it's all compressed together. And then once I compress it, I can use the output gain to bring it back up if I need to. So that's our compressor. Now we have our additive EQ. And once again, as I'm doing this, I'm basically just showing you a basic signal chain of getting started with mixing. There's nothing wrong with doing additive EQ, cutting frequencies and boosting frequencies before you go to compression. But typically this is a good practice for those of you getting started with mixing. So we've got our saturation here with the tape. We've got our reductive EQ. We've got our compressor. We've got an EQ8. And now I'm going to boost frequencies that might sound nice. And it adds a little bit of brightness to the guitar, so it cuts through the mix a little more, which is kind of nice. So I'm going to boost a little bit of this high end. And then we can also do our sweeping technique, like I showed you earlier. And then what we want to do is every time we do something, we want to bypass it, really. We want to make sure that our ears aren't playing tricks on us. So after I do every move, which I normally would do all the way up to this point, but I haven't to save time, is I would turn something on or off after I do it. So you can see it brought some of that warmth and present back. And I would do the same for this and for the entire EQ itself. So you can see it definitely makes a difference. It adds more presence back to that guitar. So once again, we got saturation, reductive EQ, compression, additive EQ. And then what we can do is we can add effects like a chorus or a delay or something fun to give it some of that width and presence. So I'm going to just choose a delay. We've got our feedback. I'm not going to go super deep into delay, but I'm going to add a little bit of presence with some delay and make it sound a little wider.
Start at 221 and amping on the 5, hoping that crossing state lines would help.
So it really kind of gives it some space there. And then the last thing I'll do is reverb. So reverb is really just creating space. If you don't have reverb on anything in a song, it's going to sound really dry. It's going to not have a lot of space or depth, and it sounds very unnatural. So what I'll do is I can drop a reverb here on the end and be very subtle with this. And I'll just take the dry wet for now and just kind of adjust it to taste. And then I can choose the decay time of how much I want this reverb to continue to repeat cycles and over. If you have a high decay time, it's going to sound really big and really repetitive, and it's just this huge space that's repeating. If it's too much, then all these high frequencies can basically cause problems with the mix. So we're being very careful with this. And there you go. This is kind of a good basic way of getting started. And I would do this usually starting with the drums and then the bass and then going on to lead guitar. Everything gets kind of its own treatment, but a really good thing to take away as far as creating a signal chain and working on each individual instrument after you finish a song is just kind of having your saturation, your reductive EQ, compressor, additive EQ, maybe a delay, and then maybe some reverb. Typically, it's good to add a little bit of reverb to every track, whether it's on the actual insert of the track, like I did with this reverb, or I could delete this and just use my reverb on my return track and just add each instrument just a little bit to give it some of that space and put everything into one big group hug of the same reverb.